All right, so you're here because you want to get a sense of how Palestinians are reacting to, well, Trump being back in the White House.
Yeah, and with this war with Israel still raging on, it adds, well, a whole other layer of complexity.
Right, absolutely. And, to put it mildly, the situation's tense, the conflict's escalating,
Sure.
and this election just adds to all of that. So to get a clearer picture, we're diving into a bunch of different sources today.
Absolutely.
We've got statements from Hamas officials, interviews with Palestinians in Ramallah.
Right.
We're even looking at reactions from Israeli settler leaders to try and really, see the whole picture here.
Yeah, that's key. It's really interesting to me how many Palestinians, especially in Ramallah, are reacting with this kind of apathy. But it's not, indifference.
No, right.
It's more of a hopelessness, like the sense that things, no matter what, can't get any worse.
Yeah, it can't get any worse.
Yeah,
It's like we've already hit rock bottom. How much
exactly.
lower can we go?
The worst case scenarios that people always associate with a Trump presidency,
Right.
loss of freedom, economic hardship, violence escalating,
Right.
those are already their reality.
Yeah, that's their life. It's their daily life.
I mean, one Palestinian librarian put it really, really bluntly. They said, and I quote, "What we have seen has made us believe that the whole of Western ideology is a lie.
Wow.
They never cared about us. What they care about is the good of Israel. That is a one thing they can all agree on."
That's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah.
And it really highlights, I think, that feeling of disillusionment that you find among a lot of Palestinians.
Yeah, towards the West especially.
Right.
And that disillusionment, it's really, really deeply rooted in, well, this conflict that's been going on forever,
For sure.
especially what's going on in Gaza. They see the U.S. very specifically
Yeah.
as playing this big part in their suffering,
Right.
regardless of who's actually in charge.
Yeah, no matter who's president. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here. We have Hamas calling for an immediate end to the war right after Trump won.
Right.
This is where things get, really interesting, right?
It is, because Hamas has been so critical of Trump in the past.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, condemning his policies, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, for instance.
Right?
The deal of the century that he put forward, they saw that as, very heavily biased towards Israel.
Right. And I think for people who maybe aren't as familiar, the deal of the century, this was Trump's peace plan.
It was.
That basically, Israel annexing huge parts of the West Bank
Absolutely.
and, really limiting Palestinian sovereignty.
It was. And it was, widely rejected. I mean, by Palestinians, by the
Yeah.
international community. It wasn't a good deal.
No. So it is, kind of surprising to see them appealing to Trump now,
Yeah.
after all that condemnation.
Right. I mean, where they are now really shows just how desperate they are to find some kind of path to peace.
Yeah.
I mean, Bassem Naim, he's a Hamas spokesperson. He urged the U.S. to just, stop giving blind support for Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They're hoping, maybe naively, that Trump might offer, a different approach than Biden would have.
Right. Maybe he's the wild card that
Yeah.
can shake things up.
Totally. But, while some Palestinians are kind of clinging to that hope, there's also a huge amount of fear.
Right.
Many are just, deeply worried about what this could mean for their future, a Trump presidency.
Right. And we're talking, real concrete concerns here.
Absolutely.
Increased settler violence.
Right.
Further economic hardship.
Yeah.
What about these Palestinian institutions that are already so fragile?
Already so fragile. And one very specific thing they're worried about is losing access to UNRWA.
Right.
This UN agency provides, healthcare, education, food assistance to millions of Palestinian refugees.
Vital stuff.
Vital stuff. And Trump cut off funding to UNRWA during his first term.
Right.
And a lot of people are scared he'll do it again.
Yeah. And, that would be just devastating, especially on top of how bad the economy is already in the West Bank.
Absolutely devastating. I mean, you're talking about UNRWA supporting over 5 million Palestinian refugees.
Wow.
Cutting off that funding would just, push so many families into poverty.
Lots of desperation.
Into desperation. And then, adding to that anxiety is potential for more settler violence.
Right.
I mean, one Israeli settler leader was quoted saying, quote, "The threat of a Palestinian state is off the table right after Trump won."
Wow.
I mean, that statement is chilling.
Yeah.
And it points to a possible shift in Israeli policy towards annexing the West Bank.
Annexation. It's a really complex issue.
It is.
But basically, it would mean Israel just taking over formally parts or maybe even all of the West Bank,
Exactly, and making it part of their territory.
their territory.
Which would mean a huge loss of land for Palestinians.
Right.
Loss of autonomy. They would essentially be like second-class citizens in their own land,
Right.
subject to Israeli law, Israeli control.
Yeah, I mean, and haven't we already seen, like, steps towards this annexation?
We have the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. He's been, transferring control of certain areas of the West Bank from the military to civilian authorities.
Okay.
And this is seen by a lot of people as like this slow creep towards annexation.
Okay.
And they're worried that a Trump presidency will just make it happen faster.
Right, speed up the process.
Yeah. We've talked about a lot of anxieties, but it's important to acknowledge that not all Palestinians are, freaking out about Trump being back. Some of them just see it as, well, business as usual.
Like, it doesn't really matter who's in the Oval Office.
Exactly. They think both Democrats and Republicans always end up putting Israel's interests first, ahead of Palestinian rights. They'll point to, decades of the U.S. sending military aid, financial aid to Israel,
Right.
often without really caring about human rights violations against Palestinians.
So basically they're saying the U.S. is just inherently biased against them.
Yeah, no matter who's in power. And this, skepticism, it goes beyond just the U.S.
Okay.
They look at the UN, the EU, other big players, and they just see inaction.
Like the world's turned a blind eye.
Exactly, a blind eye to their suffering, and that they haven't held Israel accountable.
So it's this feeling of abandonment.
Yeah, and betrayal. But there's another perspective here, one that's, a little unexpected.
Okay.
Some Palestinians actually feel, get this, a glimmer of hope.
Hope? Really? I mean, with
Right.
all these fears we've been talking about, how is that even possible?
Right. It's a real paradox.
Yeah.
But for some, that hope comes from, Trump being so unpredictable.
Okay, so they're not putting their faith in his policies,
Mm-hmm.
but more in the fact that he could just, shake things up.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, that could accidentally create some kind of opening for progress.
It's a long shot.
Totally. But there are historical examples of this kind of thinking.
Like what?
Look at the Oslo Accords back in the 90s. Those came about partly because the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right. Huge change in the world.
Massive. It opened up this window of opportunity for negotiations. And some Palestinians think Trump's presidency, with all the chaos and disruption, it could lead to similar unforeseen opportunities.
So they're acknowledging the storm, but hoping it might clear the air.
Yeah. They're not, naive to the risks, but they still have some hope. They see that possibility for change, even if it comes from an unexpected place.
And this perspective, even though it's not as common, it's still really important to understand the full range of reactions.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we've got those who are just in despair, those who are resigned to the status quo, and then those holding on to this, tiny thread of hope.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It's complex. So
Yeah.
how do we make sense of all of this?
Well, the biggest takeaway here, I think, is that there isn't one single Palestinian perspective.
Right.
There's this really deep sense of division because the situation is so complex.
Yeah.
Their reactions come from, decades of conflict, broken promises, feeling abandoned by the international community.
So their experiences shape how much they trust, how skeptical they are, how hopeful they are.
Exactly. But even with all these different opinions, there are some things a lot of them agree on.
Like what?
The fear of annexation, the concern about settler violence increasing, worrying about what will happen to the economy.
These aren't just random fears. They're based on what they've lived through.
Absolutely. And on history. So we need to really understand where those anxieties come from and acknowledge the real dangers they're facing.
So what can we do as people who are, trying to stay informed? How can we actually engage with this issue in a meaningful way?
First step, keep learning. Don't just rely on the headlines. Go find Palestinian voices. Read their stories. Listen to what they've been through. Try to grasp all the nuances of this conflict.
So approach it with an open mind and be willing to question our own assumptions.
Exactly. And don't shy away from, difficult conversations. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues about this. Share what you've learned. Listen to what they think. Try to find some common ground.
And if you want to take action, there are ways to get involved.
Absolutely.
Support organizations that are, on the ground providing aid.
Right.
Advocate for Palestinian rights. Promote peace and justice.
Every voice matters.
Yeah. Even small actions can help create change. It feels like we're at this turning point.
It does.
With so much uncertainty.
Yeah. But if there's one thing this whole deep dive has shown us, it's how resilient the Palestinian people are.
They are. I mean, even with all the hardship, they keep resisting, they keep hoping, they dream of a better future.
It's pretty powerful. That spirit of resilience. It's this reminder that even when things seem impossible, the human spirit, it finds a way.
It's inspiring, for sure.
Yeah,
Makes you want to stand with them in their fight for justice, for equality.
it does. So I guess the big question is, where do we go from here?
Yeah, what's next for this conflict?
That's for history to tell us. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is far from over. And this election, it's just one piece of a very, very complicated puzzle.
It's like we've zoomed in on this specific moment,
We have.
analyzed it from all these angles, and now we're zooming back out to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And as we zoom out, we got to remember what we've learned, the different perspectives, how deep the anxieties run, how resilient they are, and just how complex the challenges they face really are.
And remember, this isn't just some political game playing out somewhere far away.
No,
This conflict, it has a real human cost.
it does.
And those lives, they deserve our attention,
They do.
our empathy, our support.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I have a question for you, our listener. Could Trump being back in the White House, even with all the worry it's causing, actually be the thing that forces us to have a more honest, more open conversation about this conflict? One that goes beyond, the same old arguments and
Yeah.
recognizes that everyone involved, they're all human.
That's a powerful question. Could this be what finally shifts the conversation? I feel like we've only scratched the surface here.
Oh, yeah.
There's so much more to dig into, so many nuances.
Right. And that's what makes it so, I don't know, fascinating, that the
Yeah.
Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's like the more you learn, the more layers you uncover.
Right. It makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Yeah.
Makes you face, some hard truths.
For sure.
But hopefully in the end, it helps us all understand each other a little better.
Absolutely. And even though, this whole deep dive has been about how Palestinians are reacting to Trump winning, I feel like we've touched on something much, much bigger.
Like,
That hope, that hope people have, even when things are really tough.
right.
Hope for peace, hope for justice, even just hope for a better day tomorrow.
Yeah, it's powerful.
It is, that little bit of optimism. It's always there, even in the darkest times.
Absolutely. So, as we're wrapping up here, thinking about these Palestinian perspectives, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final thought.
Okay.
We've talked about all the anxiety, the uncertainty, how complicated it all is.
Mhm.
But what about the possibility of change? Could this moment, even with all the challenges, actually push us towards a new kind of conversation? One that's more, I don't know, empathetic, more understanding of all the different sides.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And the answer, I think, it doesn't just lie with the politicians, the world leaders.
Right.
It lies with each of us.
Okay.
Our willingness to, engage with this issue, to listen to each other, to challenge our own biases, that's how real change happens.
So keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep talking about this.
Yeah.
Because, Mandela said it best. It always seems impossible until it's done.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And who knows, maybe that dream of peace and justice that seems so far off, maybe it's not so impossible after all.
Maybe not.